Hey guys, I mean, I can already make a good case for this without even watching the video yet, but let's see what Money and Macro have to say. So, preemptive like, preemptive subscribe, why Europe will be stronger without America. So, should we just get into it? And then, hi guys, my name's Connor if you're new, sorry. Whenever I look at the camera and I haven't said hi, I feel rude. It's like I'm looking at an eye. Eye contact. Eye contact. All right. What was I going to say? Oh, so in the very short term, yeah, Europe might be slightly less stronger than it was with America, but in the medium term to long term, depending on how quickly Europe acts with the way America and the Trump administration is acting, and with the war in Ukraine on their doorstep, I'm sure it will fast track quite quickly. And so when you come more diplomatically, I say these, militarily and diplomatically independent from the USA, and you raise your military budgets and get rid of your independence on a lot of American military technologies, then yeah, of course you're going to be stronger without America.
This leaves the continent vulnerable to a...
And in terms of trading, you're not have to... Anyways, let's go.
The US wants out of Europe. This leaves the continent vulnerable to a large neighbor that is projected to outspend all European countries combined next year, at least when it comes to effective defense spending. So now in Europe the debate has begun. What parts of the welfare state should they cut so that Europeans can afford to defend themselves? Should they reduce healthcare spending, education spending, or perhaps social protection in general? This entire debate is nonsense. That's right, in this video I'm going to make the case that the US leaving Europe to defend itself will make Europe's economy stronger, not weaker, and therefore increased defense spending will not require cutting Europe's welfare state.
Interesting.
At least for now. But look, I realize that this is a bold claim. In fact,
in the USA, I know the reason a lot of people say you're going to have to take money from your welfare state if you want to increase your military is because usually welfare budgets are the giant piece of a pie of someone's annual revenue or annual spending, I think. I'm still learning on this stuff, guys. I find it fascinating, but I'm still learning. So if I come across as too confident and I'm wrong, call me out, like always.
About Europe as a person, like you or me, who needs to spend less on something to be able to spend more on something else, my claim makes no sense at all. But entire economic systems work in very different ways than people. So to find out how increased defense spending will make Europe's economy great again, let's do a quick refresher on our Macroeconomics 101.
Oh, God.
If you look at macroeconomics in its simplest form, the economy is a system of people and machines, also known as labor and capital. People work some hours and using machines they produce goods and services. The value of those goods and services is what we call total output, or GDP, gross domestic product. If an economy is operating at its full capacity, then there is a very low unemployment rate and there are hardly any idle factories. In such a society, if they want to get more people into the army, it means that companies can make fewer consumer goods. But because soldiers still provide a service, defense, GDP may remain the same. However, given that soldiers still earn money and therefore want to keep buying consumer goods, of which now less is produced, this may or will likely cause their prices to rise. Consumer prices going up, that is inflation. So in this case, thanks Thanks to the extra defense spending, the economy has reached the limit of its capacity to meet all the demand that's there. This causes inflation. Economists call this overheating. A well-run economy should have low unemployment and high capacity utilization of factories. It employs all the resources that it has available and therefore grows slowly as technology progresses. As we've seen, if a war comes along, such an economy will be pushed above its sustainable potential, causing inflation, meaning that it's overheating. This framework can explain what happened to Israel after
Above its sustainable potential.
Utilization of factories. It employs all the resources that it has available and therefore grows slowly as technology progresses. As we've seen, if a war comes along, such an economy will be pushed above its sustainable potential, causing inflation, meaning that it's overheating. This framework can explain what happened to Israel after October 2023 or to Russia today. Before their wars, these economies were roughly at full potential with really low unemployment. Then, when their respective wars started, it pushed these economies temporarily above potential, producing inflation. Therefore, these countries are facing a trade-off between three desirable things: high defense spending, high civilian spending, and low inflation.
Guys, but wasn't a giant thing that brought America out of the Great Recession, or wasn't World War II like a giant boon to the American economy, or did that come a little bit after the end of World War II? And I know you could say, well, America wasn't bombed like other countries were, but he's not mentioning, he's not countering in yet. Maybe he will, the damage to a country if it's attacked, right? So why would the USA's economy boom so much if so much of its labor force went to either military production or to soldiers? Does anyone know? Am I making sense?
An economy that is at full capacity cannot have all three of desirable things: high defense spending, high rarely above.
I really need to I want to understand. So I'm sorry. I'm gonna rewind.
Potential, producing inflation. Therefore, these countries are facing a trade-off between three desirable things: high defense spending, high civilian spending, and low inflation. An economy that is at full capacity cannot have all three of these desirable things. Therefore, we could call this the war economy trilemma. After October 2023, Israel was facing this trilemma. Initially, it spent more on defense and saw inflation go up. Therefore, it initially raised interest rates to reduce civilian spending. But then in 2024, it ultimately called off a full-scale invasion of Lebanon, likely partially due to economic concerns. On the other hand, Russia has chosen to both raise interest rates and accept higher inflation for now to be able to continue its massive war spending efforts to conquer Ukraine. Now, using this framework, we have already learned something interesting, I think, about Europeans. High inflation is not an option, it's not even discussed. Europeans don't control their central bank, so obviously the only option then is to cut government spending on welfare. In this context, the current debate, cutting spending on welfare, makes total sense. If the European economy was, at least, at or near its full capacity, I would be on board with this debate. I'm not a fan of inflation, I'm not advocating for ever increasing government debt, but in this video, I'm going to make two bold claims. The first is that Europe's economy is operating well below its potential. And the second is that the proposed increase in defense spending is small enough to get its economy closer to its potential without pushing it above its potential. Therefore, the war economy trilemma framework is not yet the right framework to talk about Europe, because America leaving will make Europe's economy stronger by bringing its economy closer to its potential. But okay, this channel is an analysis channel. The goal is to understand our economies based on evidence. So what is my evidence to back up these pretty bold claims? For claim number 1, Europe is operating well below its potential, I have 3 pieces of evidence. First, Europe's unemployment rate is well above that of the United States and has been for a very long time. Second, Europe's capacity utilization, how much it uses its factories, has kept dropping after COVID, meaning that there are plenty of spare factories, especially in Germany. Finally, while Europe did see quite a bit of inflation, most research indicates that this was primarily caused by COVID supply disruptions and then by skyrocketing energy prices after Russia invaded Ukraine. However, crucially, if Europe needs to spend too much on increasing its defense, then of course we'll still get to the war economy trilemma trade-off, but that is currently not the case for 4 reasons. First, when it comes to manpower, European think tank Bruegel has estimated that Europe will need about 300,000 new soldiers if American troops were to leave. At the same time, there are almost 13 million unemployed people.
And an annual defense spike at 250 billion in the short term. What is the short term?
American troops were to leave. At the same time, there are almost 13 million unemployed people in the EU. So while of course not all unemployed people are fit to serve in the army, there's
Nor they might not want to.
a really wide margin of error here. Second, when it comes to
Conscription, man.
utilizing Europe's factories, there are some really hopeful signs that Europe can produce enough military material. First of all, while Europe does rely on the US quite a bit, especially for air defense, Europe's military industrial complex is still well diversified enough overall, especially in France, which never fully trusted the US and therefore maintained military.
Smart. I did a video on this. It was in response to that French senator's speech. De Gaulle was right all along. You know, Marshall Plan was one thing to help rebuild. Can't rely too much on one country. You never know what's going to happen.
Military capabilities across all domains.
It seems like France should be kind of the lead here, but you don't want to make the same mistake as having everyone else reliant on one country like France. But France, I know, is the one, I believe, is the one nation in Europe, in NATO, in Europe, that has the ability to conduct its military operations completely without the U.S., including nuclear weapons, which I don't believe the U.K. can, because I believe the U.K.'s nuclear delivery systems, their rockets, are American rockets. So I think starting with France, maybe helping the UK get a more independent delivery system of its nuclear weapons, and not because you're definitely going to use them, but just for threat purposes. And Germany, really the economic powerhouse of Europe, to really get things into gear. Then you'll have Poland, you'll have Sweden and Finland, and you could, Italy, for terms of, controlling the Mediterranean. Huge potential.
Domains, unlike Germany, for example. Third, Europe still has a good industrial base when it comes to industries that can be transformed relatively easily to make war materials. For example, Europe produces input materials like chemicals and steel on a much greater level than the US. And it increasingly...
Sorry, what material?
Chemicals and steel on a much greater level than the US. And it increasingly now has empty car factories that can be repurposed. In fact, this is already happening in Germany, where German defense company Rheinmetall recently announced it may repurpose several Volkswagen factories to make armored vehicles.
The one crippling factor that is huge is that Europe, the European parts of NATO, I believe, don't have much oil producers. Norway isn't in NATO, is it? Is Norway in NATO? Even still with Norway, I mean, they're not a big exporter, I don't think. But like the USA is, I believe, the biggest oil producer in the world. Russia is obviously huge, and you have OPEC countries. But you need to cut your reliance of oil and natural gas from Russia, if that's your main adversary, which it is. And I'm not sure. Maybe I know Norway has oil reserves. I think Britain has some oil and natural gas reserves. France might have some in its overseas territories. And maybe you can get deals with OPEC, but that's not that reliable. So yeah, I think a big Achilles heel of Europe is its oil independence production.
Finally, when it comes to Volkswagen factories to make armored vehicles. Finally, when it comes to spending in general, Bruegel and NATO have estimated that Europe needs to raise spending from about 1.9% of GDP to 3 or 3.5% respectively. That is still only half of what economies like Russia and Israel are spending on defense today. Therefore, I think it is likely that the current defense spending will push Europe's economy closer to its potential rather than over it, making the continent's economy stronger and thereby keeping government debt loads manageable and avoiding inflation. However, at this point you may ask, but hold on a second, Yuri, if Europe's economy is operating below its potential, do we really need defense spending to get it back to potential? Can't we instead spend on nicer things like education or healthcare? No. After all, Europe has been operating far more below its potential than the US for such a long time now already. So on its own, Europe has not been able to bring its economy to potential. But of course this raises the question, why? In other words, why does Europe need a military threat to activate the full potential of its economy? To answer that question, I think it's important to emphasize that there is essentially no European economy. That is, there is no European government that can decide to increase spending to lift Europe's economy towards its full potential. Instead, there are countries with exceptionally low government debt in the north and
But you can decrease obligations to EU EU obligations so other countries can use that to increase their military budget?
Instead, there are countries with exceptionally low government debt in the north and countries with exceptionally high government debt in the south. The northern economies are considered to be very competitive and have very low unemployment, while those in the south have very high unemployment and are considered not very competitive. If we follow standard economic theory, wages in the north should therefore rise as workers are in short supply. This would then make these countries less competitive, compelling industry to move to the south. This would make the south then more competitive, lowering unemployment and lowering, importantly, the government debt burden in these countries as their economies grow. However, in Europe, this balancing mechanism is blocked for two reasons. First, northern countries have long complained that southern governments are too eager to regulate and overspend, which kept wages relatively high. This is why they forced austerity on the
In other words, they're calling them bad with money.
Wages relatively high. This is why they forced austerity on the south after the euro crisis. Since then, countries like Spain have become more competitive. However, despite significant labor market reforms, southern countries have still struggled to attract sufficient companies. Many economists have pointed out that this is because the balancing mechanism was not just blocked by the south, but also by the north, whose governments have artificially suppressed wages through collective bargaining and by keeping government investment spending lower than it should be, especially in Germany, which now has crumbling infrastructure. This dynamic means that southern countries operate below their potential because they cannot get out of debt. But even more strikingly, it means North European countries operate below their potential by choice. North European workers have chosen to accept lower wages voluntarily, and North European voters kept voting in parties that underinvested in infrastructure and education. Why would they do that? That seems rather strange. Well, according to economists like
It kind of describes the USA a bit.
Berkeley professor that seems rather strange. Well,
Underfunding in education and infrastructure. I'm like, definitely doesn't happen over here. No issue here.
according to economists like why would they do that? That seems rather strange. Well, according to economists like Berkeley professor Barry Eichengreen, this can for a large part at least be explained by the fact that European economies have fixed exchange rates or something similar in the form of the euro, and it's not a united country. You see, if exchange rates cannot be adjusted, a country that is too competitive will accumulate euros, but if a country is not competitive enough, it will run out of euros completely, causing a massive crisis such as the one the South experienced in 2011. This theory can explain why, without an external threat, a massive external threat, Europe's economy will be run at below what it is capable of. Northern countries underinvest and keep wages low, hurting their economies, so that they can stay on top of the economic pecking order, avoiding a crisis at all costs. This hurts the southern economies, which cannot easily become competitive given that the natural balancing mechanism is blocked by the north. But now, with a strong external threat, this dynamic is shattered. Poland and, more importantly, Germany are now turning on the spending taps.
Coalition unveils bumper $1.3 trillion spending pledge as countries break with constitution to revive economy. Oh, I thought it was just for military spending.
This may slightly overheat their economies, but as these economies import more from the south, especially from Italy, which is Europe's second industrial powerhouse after Germany, this will enable indebted southern governments to spend more as well then. In other words, increased defense spending in the north will unlock a virtuous economic cycle in which increased spending in the north unlocks increased spending in the south, which again unlocks more spending in the north, right until Europe's economy reaches its full potential.
Doesn't that depend, though, on Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece all spending? Like, how do you know that the Greeks and Spanish and Portuguese, if the Italians do this plan and spend more, will follow suit? How can you count on that? Am I missing something?
Southern governments to spend more as well then. In other words, increased defense spending in the north will unlock a virtuous economic cycle in which increased spending in the north unlocks increased spending in the south, which again unlocks more spending in the north, right until Europe's economy
I can see that for Italy, who's another industrial powerhouse, but the others
reaches its full potential. This means that we don't have to talk about cutting the welfare state just yet, as the war economic trilemma is not yet applicable to Europe. At least that is the case that I'm making in this video. But could it be that I'm wrong? Yes, of course. You see, on this channel I make economic analysis based on data and economic theories. I try to be as transparent as I can about the specific data and theories that I use. However, the world of macroeconomics is highly uncertain. It depends on the actions of unpredictable politicians, and on top of that, we don't have access to all the macroeconomic data even. So, what are the main assumptions that I made to make my case, and how could they be wrong? First, I assumed that the estimates about extra spending and manpower by Bruegel are correct. However, these estimates are based on the current situation on the battlefield, in which the Ukrainians are just holding out against the Russians. But if Ukraine falls, in that case, Europe may need to spend a lot more on defense, as Russia just got a lot stronger. My second big assumption was that Europe's economy is below its potential based on current unemployment and industrial capacity and inflation data. However, thanks to rapid aging, Europe's economic potential could rapidly come down. Actually, I think this is the weakest part of my analysis. In the next 25 years...
I love this guy now. I officially love this guy. I love it when people end and intertwine antitheses and problems in their own argument I feel like so many people don't realize that this helps your argument, and it makes it seem like you don't have some agenda or some like idea you're so attached to that you want to do it. He's showing some of his assumptions, some less of an assumption than others, and some things that can change. I automatically love this guy.
I think this is the weakest part of my analysis. In the next
Oh God, see?
25 years, Europe's working age population is projected by the UN to decrease by about 50 million. This is far more than the people who are currently unemployed. This could quickly bring the continent to its potential output. It may mean difficult choices with regards to the welfare state need to be made after all real soon. However, 25 years is a long time. Europe could increase defense spending now to bring its economy up to its potential and then reduce defense spending as its population ages. After all, Russia's population is also aging very rapidly, so that threat may decrease then as well. On top of that, European defense spending could become a lot cheaper if it was centralized rather than done by each country on their own.
That's a bit tougher.
Finally, population projections are not everything. Migration can change it substantially. For example, Spain's population was also projected to decline due to very low fertility, but instead it is rapidly rising thanks to migration from Latin America. Who knows, the rest of Europe could get the same from North America. Finally, I think it's important to highlight that I assume that Europe's divided nature is keeping it back. As we've seen, this is a respectable economic theory, but it is not the only one. Another theory is that excessive regulation is holding it back, but if that's the case, I'd argue that we still don't need to cut the welfare state right now. We should just cut regulation instead.
This is a big difference. I don't I get confused when people bring up like one-to-one comparisons between the EU and the USA. It's like in the USA, let's say like states in the USA are equal in this situation to countries in the EU. Take Nebraska, take Georgia, and take Greece, okay? In Georgia, you have a governor who's like the president of the state, and then Greece, you have a president or prime minister, whichever they have, their leader. And even if Greece disagrees on something they want to do and Georgia disagrees, Georgia can be pressured by political implications by other politicians within their party and by the president and ruining something, and then they can be persuaded much more easily than, say, Greece can, who their president or prime minister isn't answerable to anyone. Of course, they could have repercussions, I guess, if they don't engage in some things that the EU wants, but the USA is much more of a cohesive entity. Yes, has 50 states with 50 governors, right? But there are much more ways to negotiate within their own party to make something happen militarily, right? Where a place like Greece or Spain and the EU, that's so much tougher over there, right? If you disagree, let me know.
So whichever road I followed, I came to the same conclusion. America's defensive retreat, while extremely regrettable and importantly horrible for the people of Ukraine right now, does have a silver lining. It will make Europe's economy great again. But of course, there are many more American allies than just the Europeans that find themselves in a similar predicament as Europe. What should they do? You can read all about that in the sponsor of this video, The Economist. I highly recommend you follow up this video by reading their analysis on how these countries should respond. Then read up on their analysis of how Putin aims to trap Donald Trump. And finally, I recommend you check out this article about how the war has allowed Ukraine's powerful drone industry to thrive and come to life. Indeed, if you like
Ukraine, and you could say Russia as well, despite the amount of men they've lost. Ukraine, I feel like experience is so much more powerful than numbers on a spreadsheet showing military power. In my opinion, Ukraine and Russia, their experience in modern warfare is higher than anyone else because they're fighting a modern war right now in Europe. So yeah, Ukraine, is a much better military just because of their experience in modern warfare.
But are still hungry for more economic analysis, then I highly recommend use the link below to get yourself an annual subscription to The Economist for a 20% discount.
Make sure to use Money Macro, guys.
So whether you prefer to enjoy the print edition over a cup of coffee or their app's digital weekly edition, you'll always stay on top of global trends no matter where you are. So don't miss out, click the link in the description below or in the top comment, or head over to economist.com/moneymacro to claim your exclusive 20% discount today.
And make sure, guys, use the /moneymacro. So not just because you get the % off, but because it makes sure the sponsor knows who sent them there, and I'm watching his video, just the right thing to do, and you get the 20% off. The big thing that sums up this video for me and how Europe will be stronger without America is going back to de Gaulle and to France, okay? You can't, just the fact that you are not beholden as much to a country, one single country, all right, that is proven to be very volatile and changes, often changes presidencies every 4 years or sometimes 8 years, right? Even if Republicans lose in 2028, right, and a Democrat comes in who tries and build up relations, well, how do you know you're not going to elect another Trump guy in 2032, you know? So regardless of who wins next time, you don't know, the uncertainty isn't there. And the French knew this from the start, that they didn't want to be too reliant on the United States for this reason exactly. You don't want to be beholden, no matter how friendly a country might be. They could be your closest ally, right? Never put your country's people's deaths in the hands of another country, no matter how allied you might be at the time, okay? Doesn't mean don't have alliances, but be able to protect yourself by yourself if it comes down to it. So I think that's the big reason why this is the case, the title. Love y'all. Appreciate any comments. As you can probably tell, I'm not the most knowledgeable on this stuff, but I love learning about it with you guys. Your comments help. If I said anything incorrect, call me out on it. I always want to see that. I encourage it. I want to see it. And any comments at all. Hopefully I'll see you guys next time. Like, subscribe. We'll keep on learning together. Bye, guys.